All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to get started with our final panel, which is the International, and I'm amending to say, and U.S. Territory Energy Infrastructure Developments Panel. And one of my favorite people is going to moderate this panel, and she is Valerie J. Karplus. She is the class of 1943 career development professor and an assistant professor of global economics and management at MIT at the Sloan School of Management. So Valerie studies resource and environmental management in firms operating in diverse national and industry contexts, with a focus on the role of institutions and management practices in explaining performance. And this next statement could not be truer, which is that she's an expert on China's energy system, including technology and business model innovation, energy systems governance, and the management of air pollution and climate change. Throughout MIT, when you want to go to somebody who's an expert about China and energy, you go to Valerie. And she's been doing it for a long time. She works with a collaborative team of researchers to study the micro and macro determinants of clean energy transitions in emerging markets. And I'm sorry, Valerie, I left this out, with a focus on China and India. She's a talented researcher and professor, and this was not part of her bio, this is me, and a mentor to many women and men students. From 2011 to 2015, she directed the MIT Tsinghua University China Energy and Climate Project, a 5-year research effort focused on analyzing the design of energy and climate change policy in China and its domestic and global impacts. And last but not least, she's a faculty affiliate of the MIT Energy Initiative. So Valerie, welcome, come on up.
Thank you so much. Should I have the panelists come up too, or?
Sure.
Okay. Great, so we'll bring the panel up as well. At the same time, thank you very much, Martha, for that glowing introduction. It took me a little while to realize you were talking about me. So today, we have, I think we could say, the global energy dream team here to focus on some really important questions at the intersection of clean energy infrastructures and some of the other major challenges that we face, like resiliency, access, and human development. Energy systems around the world face a variety of challenges on many fronts. This is planning for a growing and shifting mix of demands, ensuring security of supply, affordability of supply as well, and increasing access to electricity and clean cooking fuels, along with reducing the adverse environmental and human health impacts. And I think in confronting this range of challenges, I think C3E has a unique role to play. As Ernie Moniz said last night, and I would echo this, it's terrific to see more of an international focus and international engagement by the organization. If we step back for a second, we can think about momentum on all of these issues being driven by global governance, including right now in Bonn, the efforts, the current COP to continue to push forward on global momentum on climate change, as well as UN-level efforts now enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goal 7.1 to focus on the access challenges as well. Meanwhile, we're facing already the impacts of climate change in the form of more severe storms, and that will challenge especially vulnerable infrastructures in island nations and regions. Responsibility for meeting these challenges, of course, falls to national and subnational governments and industries, and so this brings me to our very exciting panel. We are fortunate that our speakers really cover the front lines from challenges of providing clean, to providing resilient, to providing inclusive energy systems for the 21st century. So against this backdrop of global policy and aspiration, these three women are going to be able to take you to the front lines, to the ground level, to share firsthand lessons from their experiences in advancing the next generation of energy infrastructure in diverse parts of the world. So I'm truly thrilled to welcome, as I said, what I see as the Global Energy Dream Team. I'll introduce them in the order in which they are seated, and then I will invite them to come up and provide some opening remarks. In your packets, you have all of their illustrious bios. I'm going to focus on just providing sort of the high-level summary so that you can hear from them about their experiences, and we don't take too much time away from the main event. So Radhika Khosla is a visiting scientist at the Tata Center for Technology and Design at MIT. She has a rich experience working on a number of issues related to India's energy system, clean energy and energy access. Elisa Sanchez comes to us from, as a civil engineer from the Special Projects Department, the Virgin Islands Water and Power Authority in the US Virgin Islands. And she has just recently seen firsthand the impact that two major storms can have and the challenges that presents, as well as the challenges of developing energy infrastructure and making that, over time, cleaner and more resilient in an island economy. And Kate Steele is Energy Director at Power Africa, the US Agency for International Development. When I was a PhD student here at MIT, I looked up to Kate because of her immense expertise on Africa and the energy access challenge. And I think now she's really taking much of that to practice and making a tremendous impact. So I think taken together, we really have a great slice of global environments that can give us insight into some of the greatest challenges that we face. At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Elisa Sanchez, who will introduce herself and her work in the US Virgin Islands. And we'll move through the opening remarks, giving about 10 minutes for each panelist, and then I have some cross-cutting questions. And please save your questions till the end. We will allow plenty of time to dig in further. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank C3E for allowing me to come here and speak to you today and be on this panel to discuss the Virgin Islands infrastructure as it relates to energy and renewable energy. My name is Elisa Sanchez. I was born and raised on the island of St. Croix. I did come to the mainland, Louisiana Tech University, to get my undergraduate degree in civil engineering. I know you may be wondering, civil engineering at an energy conference. Yeah, I didn't expect to be here either. Immediately upon my return home, which I didn't have anything else in my mind other than to return home because, you know, it's my labor of love. I wanted to give back to the community that has provided the opportunity for me to be where I am today. So I decided to move back home, and I'm 14 years now with the Water and Power Authority, and I'm growing, learning, and experiencing new things and in the avenue of energy conservation. I have to recognize the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Climate Initiative. I was privileged to be a member of one of the first WIRE, Women in Renewable Energy mentorship programs in the Caribbean, which also afforded me the opportunity for me to be here today. Just a little background about the Virgin Islands. We are a US territory. We were acquired from Denmark back in 1917. We're comprised of 4 major islands: St. Croix, St. Thomas, St. John, and recently Water Island. As you can see, the largest island is St. Croix, which is approximately 84 square miles, which is approximately the same size as Boston. So it's pretty small. Our population is a little over 100,000 people. Just some interesting facts about the island. Point Udall, which is located on St. Croix, is the easternmost point of the United States. It's recently become an attraction because people go there on the New Year's Day to watch the first sunrise of the US. So it's increasingly more of an attraction than it was before. Some background about I'm going to call it WAPA for short. I know that acronym is used a lot for different things. We're a semi-autonomous agency which was created by legislation in 1964. And semi-autonomous being that we operate and generate our own funds, but we have oversight from governor appointees, be it his cabinet members and members of the business community. So they oversee all of our operations and major decisions. We're the sole provider of public power and water to the communities and customers of the Virgin Islands. We maintain, how we're different from the states is we're isolated. We're not connected by a grid. We're the only one that provides power, and so therefore we have the unique challenge of being the sole provider and having to be resilient and reliable. As such, we have two major power plants which we own, operate, and maintain. One power plant on St. Croix and one on St. Thomas, which provides power to St. John and Water Island. As you can see, our peak is not very much. On St. Croix, we peak at about 38 megawatts, and St. Thomas, 54. We have been known in the past to have one of the highest costs for power in the region, in the Caribbean region, to include the United States. Just to give you an understanding, the state of Massachusetts is 15 cents per kilowatt. And we're currently at our lowest rate right now at 32 cents per kilowatt hour. And so you can get an understanding of some of our challenges that we've had over the years. And the main focus has been to try and bring the cost of electricity down for our ratepayers. In doing so, we executed an RFP to get any type of alternative energy sources that we could find in order to bring down the cost of electricity. Our quickest and most beneficial option was to implement the use of propane versus diesel, which was our 100% source of electricity. We entered into an agreement with a company called Vitol, and it was attractive to us not only because they were able to supply propane at a readily available demand, but they also funded the entire project from its inception. So in 2015, we actually commissioned both systems on St. Croix and St. Thomas that allowed our units to generate dual fuel, either diesel or propane. As you know, around that time, the cost of barrel for oil started to decrease. So then customers started to see that decrease for two reasons. One, the decrease in diesel, and secondly, because propane is a cheaper source of fuel. Some of the benefits we immediately saw was there was a reduction in our emissions. There was a reduction in ground pollution, and the reduce of the cost of fuel by 30%, which we passed on to the customers. We did do an integrated resource plan, and in that plan, it gave us a footprint of where we wanted to go for our future developments. One of the major things they wanted us to do was actually go from larger generation units to smaller units. The reason for that is to provide a more reliable and efficient distribution of power. Typically, if we have issues in a plant, like our average is 38 megawatts. Our smallest generation unit is 20 megawatts. So if something happened to that unit, half the island lost power. So once we move to smaller systems, then the numbers would decrease as to how much people would be affected by those systems. We're also planning to install more underground transmission lines and distribution lines. We had an initiative back in 2015 where the former administration decided that they wanted to reduce the use of fossil fuels to provide energy. And so we embarked on a plan to reduce it by 60% by the year 2025. The first of those plans, we implemented 2 solar farms, one on St. Croix, one on St. Thomas. The one on St. Croix produces 4 megawatts to our distribution system. St. Thomas, 4.5 megawatts. We also, back in 2008, when the cost of fuel was really high, we decided to do energy conservation outreach to the community. And in doing that, we did public reaches, and we partnered with the Virgin Islands Energy Office to offer rebates to customers and homeowners to change their light fixtures to energy efficient light bulbs, energy efficient appliances, solar water heaters, things of that sort to help the customers to bring their electric bill down. As a result, we earned the 2008 Energy Star Award, which is unheard of for a power company that's in the money generating revenue business. So. We also implemented what we call net metering. Net metering is where we allow customers, businesses, and residential people to generate their own form of electricity. And we made it affordable for them so that they didn't have to provide that battery backup that was needed for them to store the electricity. So what they would do, they would, their solar panel or their wind turbines would feed the energy back into the grid system, and they would receive a credit for whatever they didn't use for the month. So the net metering system currently provides on St. Croix 5 megawatts to our grid and St. Thomas 10 megawatts, which we capped off at that. So there's no more allowances for people to contribute to the grid. We do have our lessons learned though. We've tried on several occasions to embark in different types of renewable energy sources. We entered into a power purchase agreement for wind technology, I think it was like 3 years ago. And some of the challenges that we faced was our footprint is not very big. And so the locations where we could maximize the wind were in people's backyards, so to speak. So the residents, the community wasn't very keen to wanting this technology in their backyard. We also had some logistical issues in that how would we get these very large turbines on island transported to the locations that we needed to? You know, and these are some of the things that companies that come from elsewhere don't have to think about because they don't understand, you know, dynamics of being on an island that's isolated. So those were some of the challenges in addition to financing that we faced. But we have not given up on wind technology. We did send out another request for proposal, and we're in the process of entering into another purchase power agreement to get it done, given that we know now the different challenges that we faced back then. The waste to energy technology, at the time when it was introduced, we thought it would be a win-win situation because in the Virgin Islands, we only have landfills. And the landfills can get inundated and overpowering sometimes. So we figured it would be a good way to get rid of our waste and produce energy at the same time. But here's where politics, I would say, get involved because the legislators thought it wasn't a good idea because they didn't really understand the technology and the environmental impacts they were concerned about. And from resistance from the community and their constituents, they did not approve the acquiring of the land in order to have this project go through. So that one got cut down for that reason. The biomass, which is called a king grass, giant king grass. You can see a picture of it there. When this was introduced, this is the first time I've ever heard about it. So basically, they use this king grass to generate power. And we did enter into a purchase power agreement with this company to provide 7 megawatts of power to the grid. Unfortunately, after doing the studies, they realized that they could not produce the amount of king grass needed to meet the demand. Again, because of how much square footage was needed to grow the grass and how fast it needed to be replenished. And they too had financing issues. So that just recently, I think last year, that project was canceled again. But as I said, we still have a goal to meet our 60% reduction of fossil fuels by 2015. I guess I can't talk without saying the impacts of the recent hurricanes. So on September 6th, Hurricane Irma came, and it got a direct hit to St. John and St. Thomas. It was a devastating hurricane for both islands. Majority of the homes were destroyed. 90% of our infrastructure, our electrical infrastructure was destroyed. Normally, in situations like this, during hurricane season, which is from July to November, the experts, NOAA experts, always predict for the past 5 or 6 years, this is gonna be a busy hurricane season. And we've been fortunate enough to not experience that busy hurricane season until this year. In the past, though, we've never experienced 2 Category 5 hurricanes to hit the Virgin Islands ever in the same year. And so once St. John, St. Thomas got hit, we still had hopes where St. Croix and Puerto Rico could provide support to those 2 islands. But then a week and a half came and Maria came, and then that passed over St. Croix and Puerto Rico. So then now all of your US territories, which are in the Caribbean region, are now destroyed by a hurricane. And it's difficult for us, impossible for us to provide support to one another. So as but we did have help. FEMA was in the region. You know, we have boots on the ground. We engaged in contracts prior to our hurricane season with the Northeast region power companies. So they were able to send over 300 linemen on the ground. They're currently on the ground helping us out with restoring our infrastructure. We're about 34% complete with providing customers with power. We're trying to get to 90% by Christmas, trying to restore power to the islands. As you can see in the picture on top, that's our St. Thomas solar site. It sustained about 80% damage to our solar site in St. Thomas. The solar site on the right is our district court solar site. Now, there are some large companies that have solar farms that contribute to the grid, and they were also damaged. So right now, we can't even quantify until we get full restoration how much the renewable energy contribution to the grid has been decreased and the time frame it will take to get us back to where we're at 20% prior to the storm of renewable energy contributions to the grid. So that's something we're still waiting to quantify once we get back to normal. Just moving forward, we're currently doing our mitigation plans. We use wooden power poles. We're trying to go to some composite poles so that in areas where they're totally exposed to wind, so that we don't have as much broken poles as we did in the past. Our islands are very hilly and very wooded areas, so a lot of trees uproot, fell on the power lines, damaging most of our lines. So we're trying to relocate some of our distribution lines from those locations closer to the roadside, so it's not impacted in that way again. We're also in the process of preparing a mitigation project to put more of our infrastructure underground. Currently, we have infrastructure underground, but it only goes to the hospital, the airport, and the downtown communities. So we're trying to expand that so that it doesn't take us that long to recover. But unfortunately, we have to realize, due to the increase in climate change, that, we may encounter storms every year now. And so we have to plan for that and mitigate for that. And hopefully in the future, we could be better and more resilient in that respect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Elisa. That was a terrific and sobering presentation that I think helps us understand the scale of the challenges on the ground. Next, pleased to introduce Radhika Khosla.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody here for organizing this event. I'm delighted to participate and just speak with all these incredible people in the room about an issue which is of clean energy in women that is very, very dear to me. So I'm going to speak about the context in India and how the clean energy transition is unfolding in the Indian landscape. And I'm going to start by laying out the two sets of dualities that exist when we think about India. So the first is that India is emerging as one of the important players on the global scene. It is in the top 5 economies of the world, and in greenhouse gas emissions context also, it is amongst the top 3 emitters in the world. So what sort of India is being watched, as we all know, in this context. But the second piece is that if we look at other aspects of India, that emerging power dynamic also shifts to a sort of country that is also still a premature power. And what I mean by that is that if we look at GDP per capita, the Indian GDP per capita is closer to about $5,000, $5,000 to $6,000 per person. In the US, it's closer to about $54,000 per person, and these are 2014 numbers. Residential energy consumption, or consumption that is used in homes, in India, it's about 175 units per person. That's as much as people are using. Just by sake of comparison, in 2015, that number in the US was 4,300. So it's 175 versus 4,300 units of electricity that is consumed per person in households. And in terms of per capita emissions, the Indian number is closer to less than 2 tons of CO2 per capita, whereas the US number is 18 tons per capita. So there is this sort of dichotomy where you have India on one hand being a large emitter, being in the top 5 economies of the world, but then on the other hand, still starting from a very low base of development that shows itself in these different dimensions. And the multi-dimensional poverty index, which is an indicator that is used to look and rank countries beyond income. So they include issues such as nutrition, education, lifestyle, quality of life. Over there, India ranks, it's amongst the lowest ranking countries in the world, actually, and much closer to, say, a place like Bangladesh. Now, another duality in the Indian context is that not only is India a very large emitter, it is also one of the countries that is most vulnerable to climate change. So in terms of the course, extreme heat events, disease, the number of people in India who are going to be affected by the impacts of climate change are amongst the highest in the world. And so what happens to India in terms of its growth trajectory matters not only in the global context, but also in the Indian context. And the question really becomes then, what is happening in India? So what we find at this moment in time is that India is at a unique point, an intersection, where it is undergoing unprecedented transitions. I'll give you an example of a few. Urbanization is hitting India like a force, and the largest global transition to urban centers is expected to unfold in India in the next few decades. So in terms of infrastructure, when all of these people move into urban centers, the statistic is that 2/3 of the buildings that will exist in India in 2030 are not yet built. And sort of imagining the scale of what that means, so 66% is essentially not yet existing, and all of that is going to be built in the next 10 to 15 years. In terms of jobs, 10 million people are expected to enter the workforce annually in the next 2 decades. So every year in the next 2 decades, 10 million people are going to enter the job market. And in terms of access, 800 million people still do not use clean cooking fuels. So they're using biomass, fossil fuel, biomass or kerosene-based cooking fuels, and 300 million people do not have access to electricity. Now, it's clear that the country is dealing with multiple challenges, and it has multiple objectives to overcome, which some of them are tied to clean energy and climate change, and some of them are not. There's a sort of level of development that needs to take place that is an absolute priority for the government and for the country. And for us here, we sort of, and the work that people in the clean energy world are doing, the question is how does India balance these objectives in a way where it can actually pursue tasks and activities that actually help address the clean energy and the climate change challenge. Now, what India is, the approach that they've taken, and this is laid out in the National Action Plan for Climate Change, is one which is based on co-benefits. What I mean by that is that the country has decided that it will pursue actions where both development and climate impacts and clean energy impacts are met collectively. So to give you an example, energy efficiency or renewable energy, such types of policy decisions are going to be taken by the country which does not compromise development, but also helps achieve clean energy and climate change goals. And while conceptually this is sort of, it's an attractive idea, it has been put forward, the implementation of it is a little bit more tricky. And the reason for that is when you have multiple objectives, sometimes there'll be synergies, but sometimes there'll be trade-offs across these objectives. So the country has to deal with policy questions like, should it go for a coal-based future, which might mean more access to energy access to more people, or will the air pollution effects of that be too damaging? So given that's the kind of difficult decision-making that the country is undertaking, I will give some examples of where the co-benefits approach, or at least this idea that pursuing policy and energy-related activities that are both helpful for development and for the economy are being undertaken. And renewable energy is probably the most dramatic of these. So the Indian target is that it will put in place 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. And this is in the Paris Pledge that the country has made. It is sort of almost an obscene number given where the country is starting from, which is very little renewable development. But there has been an amazing transition that has taken place. And in the last 6 years or so, the cost of solar has dropped from 35 cents per unit to about 3 cents per unit. And it is now cost competitive with coal. There are questions about whether this sort of low price is going to stay or not. But the direction of travel is clear, that renewable energy and a renewable future is in the mix for India. And if the country is able to achieve its target, then it will put online the same amount of renewable energy as the size of its entire grid right now by 2030. So it's going to add as much renewables as its entire grid by 2030. And that sort of, it is quite a remarkable statistic. I have to say that, but also say that coal is very much going to stay in the mix. And that is because the demand for energy, for electricity, is so high given the number of people who are urbanizing, the number of people who have access to electricity for the first time, and given the low base of development that they're starting with, that coal does remain dominant in the Indian energy mix until 2030. But two things that we're seeing are, one is that the private sector is increasingly less sort of attracted by coal, and there are a number of reasons for that. The price of solar and renewables is one of them. But then also just the environmental impacts in terms of air pollution, water scarcity, all of those are filtering into private sector decisions. And so on that side, the attractiveness of coal as a future fuel is going down. And then on the policy front, the government is realizing that it seems like a lot less coal might be needed. And the reason for that is that the demand that will exist in 2030 or afterwards may be less than what was originally imagined. And this is it's sort of a negotiation and a dynamic that still needs to be worked out. The decisions that will determine how much coal are still not clear. But what is clear is the rate of increase of a fossil fuel-based economy is going to be lower than what was originally imagined. Now, all of the supply is ultimately going to turn on what the demand will be. And I think that is where India has a real opportunity ahead of itself. And all of these transitions that I was talking about before, which are unprecedented in their scale, in their scope, they do present an option and an opportunity that is unique. And as counterintuitive as that might seem, the reason for that is that the country has not locked itself in to an infrastructure. Now, if all of these buildings that are going to be built are the decisions about how they should be built are yet to be made. The decision about whether transportation should be oriented towards public transportation or towards roads is yet to be made. Whether freight should be mobilized by roads or by the trains is yet to be made. And so there are these large decisions around infrastructure that could be made differently. And if that happens, there is a real moment for India to actually lock in consumption patterns that are energy efficient and that also use renewable sources much more. And I'll give you some example again of the scale that we're talking about. So by 2050, 25% of the floor space in the country is going to be residential, and the residential sector already takes more than 25% of the country's electricity. So again, just the electricity use in homes in the next few decades is going to be immense. Now, a lot of these homes are going to be electrified for the first time. And the one big change that's going to happen is that there is going to be an exponential growth in air conditioning. So it is a very hot country, and temperatures are only getting warmer. Right now, the air conditioning sort of ownership rate in the country is less than 10%, which means that in the next few years, there is going to be a dramatic increase in the air conditioning ownership within homes, and the efficiency of those air conditioners is going to make a huge difference. And because sort of right now everybody's using coolers, which takes about, say, 150 or 200 watts, an air conditioner is going to take 1,500 watts. So that there's an order of magnitude difference that could be reduced if energy efficiency is put in place. And energy efficiency in a manner where it is constantly upgraded, where there are ratings. All of these standards do exist, but they're just not implemented to scale. But the real challenge for India, to me, will be whether it is able to capitalize on this demand-side transition that is going to take place. But this transition and the opportunity from it is only as useful as the decisions that are going to be made in the next 5 years or so. So that is the kind of work that the clean energy community is doing. And dealing with demand-side solutions is not necessarily simple. It requires not just the technology, but also working through institutions and through behavior. Because ultimately, it is people who decide what kind of appliances to buy, what kind of choices to make about transportation. But given that consumption trajectories have not been locked in, the hope is that there will be a way in which India is able to align both its need for development and also sort of move forward with this force of the clean energy transition that is taking place.
Thank you very much. You've just heard from Radhika Khosla, and you can tell that we're really rapidly moving across scales, across geographies, and now we're heading to Africa. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Steele.
Thanks, Valerie. And it's a good transition because I think so much of what is happening in India right now is really leading the path for what we're seeing in the larger economies in sub-Saharan Africa, like South Africa and Nigeria. I do, of course, want to thank the C3 organizers. I think we're the last panel, so get the last thanks out to everyone. And it's really exciting for me to see this 6 years in, because 7 years ago, I was at a small meeting in the basement of DOE with clean energy ministerial people talking about, oh, we should do a women's initiative. So this has actually turned out far, far more impressive than I think we really thought at the time, which is really a credit to all of the organizers who have taken it on. And also thanks to Melanie, who I think has stepped out, who at the end of the meeting declared that MIT would host this and really take on a lot of the ownership of it, which was fantastic for me as an alum because it means I get to come back here. And then since I'm also an alum of Stanford, I was really excited they decided to join the club a couple of years later. So I'm going to talk pretty broad strokes about Power Africa. This is the US government-led initiative to address energy access in Africa. I'll be pretty brief, no slides for me either, but talk about kind of what was the founding of the initiative, what was the premise of it, where have we gotten to date? We've been doing this for about 4.5 years now. And then where do we really see this going? How do we see the infrastructure developing? What are some of the challenges and opportunities we see on the horizon? So Power Africa launched in 2013. It was initially a presidential initiative under the last administration. It was really designed to address the gap in energy access and energy availability in sub-Saharan Africa. So we've heard about a lot of large-scale energy systems. Sub-Saharan Africa, the total installed capacity is about 90 gigawatts. About half of that is South Africa. So you can then imagine that shared across population of roughly 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not a lot of power per person. And on top of that, 600 million people do not have access to electricity in their home. So it's a pretty substantial challenge that obviously impacts quality of life. It impacts economic growth. So the premise of Power Africa was, how do we try to address this using all the tools of the US government? And because it was driven by those top-line kind of megawatts and connections goals, really centered everything around that. And so Power Africa's goals at launch were 30,000 new megawatts, enabling 30,000 new megawatts of electricity generation, and enabling 60 million connections. But not trying to do that simply through USAID, where I sit. USAID coordinates the full all-of-government approach. US DOE is one of those partners that we work with. It's 12 US government agencies. We now have 15 partners, international partners. Some are bilaterals, other governments we work with. A lot of them are the multilateral development banks. We have 130 private sector partners, and we also work really closely with African governments in the countries where we're working. And the whole reason we're trying to bring together everyone to work on this problem is because if you look at what is needed to actually build out, so provide universal access, provide that energy for economic growth for industry, it's going to take ballpark $835 billion, which is not my estimate. That's been the number that was put out by the McKinsey Brighter Africa report a couple of years ago. And we don't see that coming from African governments. Clearly, there's a lot of priorities that the money's not there. I can tell you it's not going to come from US government. We're not going to build out all of that infrastructure ourselves, nor the rest of the partners that we work with on the bilateral, multilateral side. Where that money actually sits is with the private sector. And that's really where we want to try and bring them in as investors, bring them in as developers, because that is the capital that's going to build out those systems. But they're not going there. There's a lot of money that is rushing into sub-Saharan Africa right now. But on the power side, there's still a lot of challenges. So what we try and do is address those challenges. How can we both work with the private sector, figure out what are the risks that they're seeing, see what are the tools that we've got that we can help mitigate those risks, try and make it easier for them to come in. Whether that's project preparation facilities, that's grants for upfront feasibility studies, maybe just introductions that we can do on the ground. We have technical advisors who are on the ground. Or it can be something where we're working specifically with the governments and the institutions in the country. So you want to be trying to make sure that there's actually a framework for independent power producers, making sure you're working towards really cost-effective and commercial utilities to try and make it easier for that investment to come in. So like I said, we've been at it for about 4.5 years. On top of being a presidential initiative, we had the Electrify Africa Act of 2015, which was passed a couple years ago. So there's a kind of a co-creation going on from both the White House and Congress. And so there's a bipartisan bill passed that authorized Power Africa into existence as well. Slightly different targets, but same sort of initiative where we're trying to address the megawatts and connections side of this. So our results to date, we've enabled about 7,300 megawatts of new projects to reach financial close. We do count the exact financial close because that's when we think the private sector has basically put their stamp of approval, the money's flowing. We still get involved after construction, but that can take a little while, so we do count at financial close. And that represents 82 projects. And it's important when you look at those megawatts, of the megawatt number, 75% of that is natural gas. If you look at the number of projects, 75% of the projects are renewables. And that's because a lot of the projects that we see that are natural gas are big, 400, 500 megawatt plants. When we see the solar projects and wind projects coming in, they right now are a lot smaller. We are seeing a lot more growth in the renewables at the moment, though. On the connection side, we count a little over 10 million connections, roughly 5 people per household. That's tens of millions, 50 million people who have some form of access due to Power Africa. Most of that growth has happened on the off-grid side to date. A lot of it's solar home systems and smaller systems, some microgrids, but that's partly because we vastly undercount what we do on the utility side. We do a lot of work working with utilities. We don't directly finance connections, but we help with their commercial operations. I think if we can figure out how we count that better, we actually have a substantial number of connections on that side that since we launched from the utilities we work with, there have been about 5 million new electricity connections from the utilities. As far as what's next, this is what we've realized is focusing on those top 2 goals of generation and connections was great as far as getting, it was a real rallying cry, getting all these partners on board. It made it very clear what we were trying to do. Maybe we could pull in resources from all the different government agencies. But the problem is it's a little too focused on those 2 things. And we're finding this in a lot of places where they're actually going slow on generation right now because there's not transmission infrastructure to evacuate the power. And so you have to keep these things in balance. Like I said, we want to do more with utilities. There has to be a lot more connections that are going to use that power when it gets on the grid. And probably most important underpinning all of this is really the enabling environment and the policy work that makes sure that there is that clear framework for investors to come in, or make sure that they're going to be able to have a clear arbitration if there is an issue with the project. And that's the stuff that I always say it's the worst headline. And working in a DC program with government agencies, you really like to have the ribbon cutting. You like to have, everyone likes the big success story of people getting access to electricity. But you've got to do the kind of grinding work of making sure that the capacity building is there, the institutions are really being developed, because that's going to have the long-term dividends. So going forward, we're going to spend a lot more time on the transmission, on distribution, as well as on the enabling environment. As far as the challenges that we see, and Radhika alluded to a lot of these, it's very similar things that we see. This balance of affordability and sustainability, I think, is really, really central to what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa as well. And how do you actually have not just environmentally sustainable growth, but also financially sustainable? And I think tariffs are one of the clearest places that you can see this. There's a World Bank study earlier this year that showed only one of the mainland sub-Saharan African country utilities is actually fully cost recovery. As far as the tariff that they charge covers the cost of generation, transmission, distribution, and investing going forward. Only one. For the rest of them, they're losing money every single time they sell a unit of electricity. And you can do the math. It would be really obvious. You just need to raise the price, and you need to actually make it so it's cost effective for the utility to operate. But one, you're working with a lot of populations that can't afford an increase in electricity. Some places like Liberia, they have a 50 cent per kilowatt hour electricity charge, which is still not cost recovery. So you really can't increase prices a lot of places simply because of affordability, but also because it's really politically untenable. And so if there have been a number of countries that have tried to increase prices. You have riots, you have protests, and there frequently is a lot of backtracking on the increases in electricity tariffs. And you can imagine how hard this is to sell to people, that if there's power that is unreliable and expensive already, and you tell people, no, in order for it to get better, you just have to pay more per unit than what you're paying right now, it's not going to go over very well. And so I think there is a need for figuring out how to do this transition, and maybe it is through bridge financing or subsidization of that transition from getting people to a better level of service that they probably would be willing to pay for if it was that high level of service. But that's something we really struggle with all the time, is how do you make power both affordable and financially sustainable? But I will say the opportunity, and I'll close out with this so we can get to questions from Valerie and from all of you. It's a huge opportunity. And I think it was really interesting listening to the Future of the Grid panel this morning, where they were talking about the difficulties of retrofitting some of these systems. A lot of Africa is a pretty clean slate as far as building out what could be. And I think this is where there's still the challenge of how do you pay for it? How do you experiment in a place where the stakes are pretty high as far as people having first access to electricity or not? It's not a place that you want to fail or offer someone a solution that doesn't work for the long term. However, it's a lot easier to think about decentralized generation. It's a lot easier to think about demand-side management. For places where people are using prepaid meters, and so as they're seeing, they put money in, usually through mobile money, and as they're using appliances around their house, they can see it ticking down. It makes you much more conscious of how much electricity you're using. So trying to sell demand-side management in the US, where it was rightly said this morning, you only care about it when it doesn't work. If it's a substantial portion of your income and it's off a lot of the time, and you're seeing the costs kind of declining on your balance on your meter, you care a lot about using efficient appliances. Transition to CFLs was pretty seamless in a lot of the developing world because it was very clear that this was a cheaper solution for power. And I think that's some of the exciting things we're seeing in the decentralization of power, largely through solar, but sometimes through other sources, especially with solar home systems and hopefully at some point microgrids. And I think the exciting things that are happening there are innovations on financing and how you sell things to remote rural users, but also how you develop extraordinarily efficient DC appliances that can be used with a solar home system. And I think this has the greatest potential to come back to the US and back to other parts of the world as an innovation that started largely in sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of developing Asia, where it used to be a few years ago, you would have solar panel, maybe it had to be 50 watts, you could get a couple of lights, maybe you can charge your cell phone off of that, but it was also hundreds and hundreds of dollars. You now can see these tiny little panels that are 10, 20 watts, and you're squeezing out power for LEDs, cell phone charging. You get a bit bigger panel, and you have a highly efficient TV. You start to have radio, appliances, and it becomes very viable to have an entirely off-grid household at that point. And I think that's going to be something that, especially for areas that are remote from the grid right now, I don't think they'll ever be connected. I think they'll either move in or move into the cities or continue to have those systems. And I think a lot of that innovation is going to be hopefully driving some of these efficiencies that we need to see in air conditioners and white goods and all of that as the rest of the world really comes online. So I will close with that. I think I'm under time, hopefully, and we can get started with questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kate. And gather round. We need to roll up our sleeves here because we have some really tough challenges on our hands. My first question, and I only have actually one, maybe two questions for our panelists because I want to make sure that we get time for all of your questions. So be thinking of your burning questions over the next 5-10 minutes. So at this moment, we have continuation of or still good momentum established by Paris and going forward in Bonn this year on the global governance side to really try to accelerate our efforts and our global commitments to addressing climate change. And this is indeed a global problem. However, much of the action will have to happen at the country level or the region level. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how important are global governance efforts to the commitments that are being taken in the regions that you represent, and then how that is translating into action and innovation on the ground. You want to start, Radhika?
Sure. So it's a complicated answer, but the short answer is that they do have impact. And the one time where you see that very clearly is actually before Copenhagen, when there was a lot of momentum around having hopefully a productive agreement. And that was really the time when India decided to pull together all of its different actions and say, we're going to create a national action plan on climate change. And if you track, not just in sort of the climate world, but also in the energy world, there is definitely a filtration of the global momentum on an issue and how that forces a country like India to think and reflect on what it's doing domestically. Now, sometimes it's just packaging, and sort of it means that you have to tell a good story about what you're doing to sort of these more global governance, international agreement type of places. But a lot of the time, what it does is it does force a consolidation. And on climate, I think, and precisely because climate actually sits on top of all other sectors. So it forces attention away from sectoral institutional silos, which is how a country like India operates, and this is probably true across the developed and developing world. But because climate change requires linkages across these different sectors, every time there is an international forum where countries have to come together and India has to, say, prepare a document which needs to respond to that, it brings together a kind of momentum domestically, and that has been useful. It has been useful. And just the second thing I'll say is a result of a lot of these global movements is the filtration of a lot of capacity and finances and non-state actors into India, and they work in coordination and collaboratively with a lot of the domestic actors, and that has propelled efforts forward. There's no questioning that very positive effect that has come out of these movements.
Great.
Yes. I wouldn't say that we are directly impacted by the global economy on climate change. We're more locally impacted as, more for our marine life. We've seen a decrease in our reefs and, our mangroves and stuff like that. So as a result, we have, started an initiative to try and replant our mangroves, replant our reefs so we can maintain that marine life, which is critical to our infrastructure. Because as you know, tourism is a major industry, and we generate a lot of revenue, majority of our revenue through tourism. A lot of people come to the territory to deep sea diving, snorkeling, scuba diving. So it is critical to us, not only on the energy side, but on the marine side, to make sure that we protect our environment. Currently, we used to have what was formerly Hess Oil, then Hovensa, was one of the largest power plants on the Western Hemisphere that closed down several years ago. And they consumed majority of the emissions on the island. And with them shutting down, we've drastically decreased our emission levels in the island. But they still, own most of the credits as far as being able to produce emissions. Well, thankfully, EPA, they have a stringent policy in the Virgin Islands that, limits to the amount of emissions that we can have on the island. So even though St. Croix, more so than St. Thomas, is more of an industrial place, we still are limited to the amount of industries that can come and do business in the Virgin Islands, just to protect that, that lifestyle that we have.
So I can say, I can't really speak on behalf of 50 countries, but I will say to grossly generalize across sub-Saharan Africa, I think that there's been a lot of sentiment about this wasn't caused by most of the developing world. And I think this is similar to like India, where
Absolutely.
the actual net emissions coming out of sub-Saharan Africa are tiny. And so the idea of restricting emissions, I don't think always sits entirely well with a lot of governments. At the same time, though, most countries are feeling the impacts of climate change pretty much in real time. I think you do see a lot of desertification happening. Even in the years that I've been going back and forth, you see lots of differences in when the rain cycles are happening and the flood drought cycles and things like that. So I think there is an awareness, probably a very strong awareness about the need to do something. I just think where the responsibility lies for making sure that transition happens is always an interesting debate.
Great.
I just want to corroborate what you're saying, that the sentiment about we didn't cause the problem is very strong and accurate for the most part. The challenge with the sort of these global movements and activities in India, or in sort of, I can speak for India most, that come out of these global movements, is that how do you find ways in which you can link up with local needs? Mm-hmm. Because ultimately these movements or these activities or the actors who enter and work in the country domestically are only going to be as effective as their ability to actually align and find the linkages between, say, a climate agenda and a local agenda, because that's when it becomes relevant to the people you're working with.
And that's why I think, sorry to add on, I think renewables will win in a lot of cases because right now they are low cost and there's a lot of financing available for them. And I think that's driving the deployment in a lot of African countries, not necessarily a need to transition, but a feeling that there's money available for those projects.
Great. So I think it was Radhika who mentioned co-benefits, and I think everyone likes co-benefits. I mean, if you can find solutions that will perform on a number of metrics, then certainly they're more palatable. And if we think about each of the environments, I'm curious to hear just your favorite example of a bright spot. So no pun intended. Just in terms of what's happening with both clean, but also resilient, accessible, inclusive energy sources.
I can start since I've asked you before.
Okay, sure.
I'll just
Sounds great.
repeat, I guess, the one that I ended with. I think the getting solar out into households as it's almost irrelevant that it's clean. It's useful that it's clean, but it's more important that it's available and it generates power where it's needed at the household. Once the panel is paid off, it's essentially free electricity for the household. So I think it matches what the household needs, and so that's been just fantastic in terms of being able to electrify areas that are so remote from the grid. It would have been 20 years down the line before you actually extend the centralized infrastructure there.
Are there specific countries that have, in particular,
Yeah,
stood out?
it's been really revolutionary in East Africa. That starting in Kenya has a oddly long history with solar home systems from even when they were sold privately in the 90s to a lot of households. But then it's been really where there's been a lot of incubation of these small panels, financing through pay-as-you-go, with using mobile money, where most people know East Africa has been really the hotbed of mobile money, and most transactions now are done that way. And that's really spread from Kenya and now Tanzania and Rwanda and Uganda. Actually, one of the things we're trying to do with Power Africa is we've seen this model in East Africa is really packaged to scale. There's been a lot of different companies trying different things, and it's really converged on this model that is highly scalable. But there's still a lot of people to bring electricity to in East Africa, and a lot of these companies have investors. I'm sure would love to see them continue to just grow in East Africa. And what we're trying to do is incentivize them to move into new markets, especially in West Africa and Central and Southern. And we know that because of shareholders or because of the market demands they already have, they wouldn't necessarily do that without incentives we can offer them. So we do have companies now that are going into, one of the big Tanzanian companies is going into Cote d'Ivoire. We know that Phoenix International from Uganda is planning to scale up significantly across sub-Saharan Africa. So I think we are starting to see that movement, but definitely East Africa has been the driving force.
Great.
Well, for us, our company is, since we're a public provider, we're not revenue incentive, company. So it's beneficial for us. I like that we are thinking about being more efficient, more reliable, more renewed, because I think we've been challenged by private homeowners and businesses. They put their foot down and they said, you know what, if you're not going to be able to provide affordable energy, we're going to do it for ourselves. And I think that that movement has forced us to look in that direction and start actually making a move to be more efficient, be more reliable, and be more renewable in our energy supply.
I have an actual bright spot, which is the transition of the lighting industry in India. And so what happened was that about 3 years ago, the government decided that lighting is it's a large consumer of electricity, and are there ways in which we can reduce the energy that is being used from it. And they formed a company that was a joint venture of different public sector utilities. And what this entity did was it bulk procured LED lights and then sold them, and had this amazing dissemination strategy and sold them to households across the country. More than 200 million LED lights have been sold in India in the last 3 years. And the lighting industry has just changed dramatically. If you look at what manufacturers have been producing since the last 3 years, the LED lamp, if you just look at the curve, it just spikes up, whereas CFLs, on the other hand, are coming down and declining. Now, what the entity was able to do is actually cash in on the fact that a lot of people are moving into homes for the first time, And so they set up their kiosks in the center where you go to pay your electricity bill. And when you pay your bill, you actually sort of let your customer know that if you bought this bulb, it could be that your savings will, your electricity use and your bill will reduce, and actually you don't even have to pay for it up front. We'll just deduct it in monthly installments from your bill. And about a third of the people actually use that option. But what has happened, there was also a lot of campaigning. That's the other issue, a lot of campaigning on TV, on the radio, and a lot of women who actually were watching television or reading or listening to the radio were able to pick up on this new trend that was going on. And there has been a huge change in the market since then, and it's been a remarkable transition over the course of 3 years. So the fact that now homes in peri-urban areas, in affordable housing have LED bulbs, which they did not have 3 years ago, it's quite it's a nice bright spot.
Great. So let's take a few questions from the audience. I think we have mics going around. Yes, in the back.
Hi, I don't think I introduced myself yesterday, but I'm Cheryl Bennett. I'm a master's student at the New School in Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management. And so I guess I more so have a statement. Maybe we could all discuss it. So as we talk about clean energy education and empowerment, we should also talk about what developed countries owe developing countries. Developed countries have developed and made their fortunes while de-developing other countries by colonizing, capitalizing off their natural and human resources. So again, we should talk about what developed countries owe developing countries, and therefore these developing countries can leapfrog this industrial period that got us to where we're at now.
Okay, so do any of our panelists have a response?
I can simply say that was a bit what I was getting at with why people are going for solar and renewables, is because that's actually where a lot of the investment money from governments and from multilaterals are going into developing countries, I think with the intention of that leapfrogging and the intention of being able to supply something better in the near term. I don't think it corrects for the issues, but I think that is where the investment is going right now.
Right, but we're talking about investments as opposed to like, investments and people wanting to still make money from correcting a mistake or wrongs in the past. I mean, I'm not saying that money shouldn't be made, but we have to correct those wrongs. I mean, this is what a lot of this sort of awareness is happening, right now. So yeah, we could look forward. I mean, we're talking about, okay, yes, this is happening with women's issues, so on and so forth. That's great, and yes, we can do that. But let's broaden that scope and look at all the different issues. It's not just in silo or just a monolith, just one particular issue. It's lots of different issues spanning lots of different areas, and that's one of them that we need to discuss in terms of having other countries come to the same level, because it's not like, oh, it just happened. No, it was intentionally de-developed because they were empires.
I think this is a really important conversation, and we're pointing to a number of, I think, very complex and long-standing questions that I think we can certainly engage with, offline afterwards. I just want to make sure, given time, I saw at least one other question over here, maybe two actually. Yes, please.
So Kenya has made great headway in developing its geothermal resources, and geothermal is a great resource because it isn't intermittent. We don't have to pair it with some kind of storage. But all of the East African Rift Valley countries could develop their geothermal resources, and I don't see a lot of headway being made. There's been an effort to develop geothermal in Ethiopia, but it's stalled, and some of these countries really could use this source, and nothing's happening. So,
yeah, the Korbeti geothermal project in Ethiopia, I think we've been declaring it on the cusp of financial close for a couple of years now. It has been a slow process. That one actually, Ethiopia has never had independent power producers. This is the test case of that. So one of the things Power Africa has done for the last several years is help install the regulatory framework that allows for independent power producers, particularly in geothermal, in Ethiopia, which is now ratified. We've also provided legal support so that there's been someone on the Ethiopian side who can negotiate the deal with the developers who are working on the project, because that's in everyone's interest for it to be as good of a deal as possible. And that's something that hasn't been a strong capacity in Ethiopia because of lack of experience with independent power producers. So it is something that, believe me, I share the frustration on this one because it has been a long time coming. I don't want to say it's close right now because it always seems to be quite close, but that is, the goal is still to have a large-scale development of geothermal in Ethiopia. Hopefully with the same progress. The first Kenyan project took years and years and years to get started, Elikaria. But now you see the capacity in Kenya where they've been able to scale that up going through the rift. We see early days in Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania. I think at that point you'll start to have to question, is that the best resource to develop given the high cost to start now? Probably at some point, but maybe not the first option to go to. But it is something we track across the Rift Valley and are helping develop.
Great. Yes, here in the front.
One of the great things about C3E is that we've got practitioners, we've got researchers all here together. So I just wanted to ask, for those of you all practitioners in this regard, more or less, what innovations do you see coming down the pike in the next few years that are going to address some of the challenges that you see in your current work? Thank you.
And these might be policy as well as technology innovations or business model innovations as well.
And any of them. I mean, for example, the use of drones perhaps in Africa for delivering medical supplies, for example.
Great. Would like to take that. Radhika?
I don't know if I have an exciting enough answer to that question, but I think the real, and you know, I'm not necessarily sure it's going to be technological. I think a lot of the technologies that that could sort of, you know, make this transition already exist in terms of on the demand side, on the supply side. All of that is already out there in the marketplace. The real question is, how does one deploy it at scale in developing countries and in a place like India? And that to me will be much more of an institutional and a behavioral issue actually than actually developing a new sort of amazing technology that is going to solve all of these problems. To me, it seems like in India, the issue is really how do you get existing technologies and sort of, you know, things like LEDs, like appliances, all of those different renewables, how do you get that and actually make it available at scale in a way that it's affordable? And that's the sort of innovation that could be, it could be very dramatic in the change that it makes.
I know for us, we've recently deployed our AMI project, the automatic meter infrastructure, and our smart meters. So as of recent, we've been able to, you know, track our system, monitor our system, which in a way that we couldn't before. You know, you can get real-time data as far as customers that are affected, customers that, you know, may be theft of electricity, you know, so that system, although implemented, we're still working out some bugs and some fixes. So once we get it fully deployed throughout all islands, we're able to, you know, bill real time, see data real time, especially now in the recovery phase. Like I can tell you, as of this morning, the numbers, you know, we have 34% of our customers restored, and that's through the use of our SCADA system throughout the island. So that's really our newest innovative project that we've embarked on recently.
I can say a couple of quick ones on both the generation and connection side. On the generation side, I think pricing is going to be the biggest shift. And it's not a dramatic, it's been incremental, but it's been a fast increment, I guess. As far as solar in the past couple of years at grid scale has really crossed the threshold to being truly competitive in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're seeing more and more countries having large-scale projects reach financial close. A lot of developers who have been waiting for several years for that threshold to be crossed, seeing projects come to fruition. And I think US LNG hitting the world market and the flexibility in gas supply coming in, ability to have floating storage and regasification units in a lot of coastal countries, I think that that's actually going to drive a lot of new generation coming online that is pretty flexible and meets a lot of countries' needs. On the connection side, it's actually a policy change or a political will change that I think is happening. That I think for even a couple of years ago, it was, and in a lot of countries it still is, not really politically viable to say where you are going to electrify and where you aren't, because everyone who you say we're going to bring the grid here is like, yes, we will vote for you. Everyone who's over here who is not on that map does not want to vote for you. And so I think it was something that governments were really cagey about where the grid lines were going to go. And I think we've seen a couple of countries be much more progressive about the off-grid solutions. And one, like I've said previously, that it's just offering a better service than it has in the past. And it's offering a service that's really well suited for off-grid households, but also how quickly it can be deployed. That it suddenly doesn't become about, well, we're not going to run a grid line to your household for 10 years, but we're going to bring you an off-grid solution in 2 weeks. And your household is going to be watching TV and have the lights on, and it's going to be there now. I think it's become something that governments realize is actually politically greatly beneficial to them to be able to offer that. And I think that's starting to spread and will really drive the growth in that as well.
Terrific. Well, we're just about at time, unfortunately, but I think we have a really nice cross-section, certainly not an exhaustive one, of what's happening on the global stage. One of the questions posed by the panel in the program was, what lessons can we take back to the United States? And so I'll leave that for all of our terrific mainland US practitioners to consider in the break and in the days to come. I'd like to, before we thank our panelists, I'd just like to, first of all, personally thank the panelists. Also thank C3E for this tremendous opportunity. Thank Martha, Melanie, and the entire organizing team. It's great to be here, and thank you for your attention.